Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2013 CEOs Unplugged. Please welcome our moderators for the 2013 CEOs Unplugged. From Sanford C. Bernstein and Company, Senior Analyst Ronny Gall. And from CANACCORD Genuity, Managing Director, Equity Research, Specialty Pharmaceuticals, Randall Stanicky.
Well, good morning, everyone. I guess what we have in the audience today are the brave ones, because a combination of an open bar, late night casino, and an early morning start can't be the easiest thing in the world. But thank you for coming, and what we wanted to do, and this is really a great opportunity, and it's great to be a part of this again. I really think this is one of the key events at the conference, and we really take the themes that we've talked about yesterday and over the last couple of days, and we have the opportunity now to ask a panel of CEOs to dig a little deeper. And what Ronny and I have done is we've taken 7 of the most important themes we think that the association and the industry, for that matter, is facing. And what we're going to do is ask questions to the CEO panel and have a couple of them comment and get some real bottoms-up view from people who are in the trenches and driving the association. So I want to do a quick introduction.
And we have here, starting on the right, DeGolyer, the president of Sandoz, USA. Tony Mauro, the president of Mylan North America. Tom Moore, the president of Hospira USA, and Oberman, the president and CEO of Teva North America, and Siggi Olafsson, the president of Actavis Pharma.
Great. And so I don't want to waste any time. I want to get right into it. This year, we have, again, the opportunity to have Dr. Hamburg at the conference, and she's going to be presenting a lot of really big issues coming out of the FDA that will have a potentially big impact on the association this year. And so I just want to jump in from a big picture perspective, and maybe Tony, this should probably start with you. Dr. Hamburg is going to present after this panel. What are the 3 things you'd like to hear from her as you think about the Generic Pharmaceutical Association and specifically the direction of your company and the others in your industry?
Great question, Randall. And certainly when Commissioner Hamburg's here later, I think of 3 things. The first thing, we did a great job getting GDUFA enacted last year. Now we need to see it implemented and enforced here in 2013. The second would be a robust biosimilars pathway that we continue to work towards interchangeability and common INN naming. And last but certainly not least would be a more collaborative, communicative relationship between industry and the FDA moving forward. I think there's a lot we can do on that front to better build a future from a strategic standpoint at the FDA and between our association. So those would be the 3 critical areas I think I'd like to hear today from her.
Yeah, Allan.
First of all, I'm delighted to be here. This is my first time on stage, so this is a great first experience for me. And I can't help but think with the 2 of you at this end and the lights here, I feel like a skewered chicken on a rotisserie pit.
Wait till the other questions come.
I thought that's your job description, basically.
So thank you for inviting me, and Ralph, wherever you are, great job to you and your staff for putting on a terrific event so far. I just want to add one thing to what Tony said. Most of you may know that I spent the last 5 years of my life traveling around the world in the emerging markets. And the one thing that I would add, having now been back into the United States, is as we think about medicines coming into the United States from around the world, is ensuring that the GDUFA fees that we're paying, first of all, are being used, and Tony made that point effectively. But second of all, that all of the sites outside of the United States that are supplying medicines into the United States are under FDA scrutiny to a similar level as they are here in the United States.
So just following on that point, you all committed quite a amount of capital as an industry to support GDUFA, to support the FDA in regulating it, which is a very interesting partnership. There's always a question about the federal government, will you actually see the benefits of that capital being invested? And the question is for you, what were you looking for? If we kind of look the next couple of years, where should we start seeing the impact? Should we start seeing the backlog coming down? Should we start seeing a list of inspections? Where is the output from the investment of the FDA going to come back your way? Don?
Yeah, maybe if I can just add on to the last question. I think Tony's right. Clearly, the user fees are important, and biosimilar pathway, having what we would call a usable biosimilar pathway is critical. But quality and making sure that we're clear on what the current GMP standards are with the FDA, and we had that conversation with the commissioner this morning, I think is the other aspect that I would add to that point. As far as what we want to see, I mean, clearly the status quo was not an option for any of us, whether it was the FDA or industry. And I think the facts are that the backlog now is up to over 3,000 applications. It's taking more than 32 months. And what we've got to see, I think the good news is that we've got metrics in place today. But what we've got to see is accountability. And I was also encouraged by what the commissioner said this morning at our breakfast about making sure that they are accountable. And we'll start to see that towards 2015 when the timelines for the submissions to be reviewed are now getting to 15 months and then ultimately by 2017 to 10 months. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for those metrics to be accomplished in a timely manner.
And Ronny, maybe just to add to what Don said, compounding on the breakfast meeting we had with the commissioner today, the lagging indicators will be the metrics being attained, the timelines for approvals, the backlog being removed. The leading indicators that are vital are hiring. We need to see ample hiring at the FDA to ensure those targets can be hit. And the second piece is this communication. We need to have constant and vigorous communication with the agency. When those two seeds are planted significantly, I think you'll see continued output and continued attainment of these metrics which are vital to GDUFA being successful.
Siggi, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think overall I agree with what they said, what we expect, but also I think we all realize that it might get worse before it gets better. 32.5 months approval time is not acceptable, but if you need to hire all the people for the GDUFA fees, I could see the situation getting a little bit worse before we start to shorten the approval time. So I think we need to keep that in mind. But I also want to see, and I've seen it a little bit from the agency now, is the collaboration with the industry. They're reaching out. I think all the companies here have been, the FDA has reached out to us and asked for feedback, what they can do better, how they can improve the processes. So I think a cooperation and collaboration between the industry and the FDA is something I think we are looking forward to and hope we get more into that going forward.
The whole theme that you're hearing this morning is around communication. Just about everybody's answers, I think, points to improved transparency and communication with the agency. Don mentioned, quality and compliance. That's certainly something that we talked about once again this morning at breakfast that is important for the industry to have a more proactive vision, if you will, or transparency with the agency with respect to their expectations in that area. But at the end of the day, the investment, Ron, that you asked that the industry is making in GDUFA, I think communication is the cornerstone, the elements that we want to see in terms of process improvement.
So Tom, following on, I think both you and Don are alluring to something, which is the CGMP, current good manufacturing principle, and the idea that you might not have gotten in the past enough clarity on the word current. Is there a contemplation of a more structured way for the FDA to communicate what they expect the industry to get to in terms of manufacturing quality?
Well, that's certainly the ask of the industry. Once again, if you think about the ways that the industry learns, so to speak, in terms of compliance, quality expectations, it's really through the inspection process. And one of the points that I've made over time is that while that's instructive, it's also reactive. It's not a proactive way of communicating, and it's also subject to some interpretation. And so, once again, the whole theme of improved transparency, a proactive way of communicating with the industry, what the ongoing expectations or the future expectations. If you think about us, running companies, we do long-range plans, for capacity planning and so forth. Well, part of that is planning for quality and compliance as well. And to have a better forward-looking view of that helps us with our long-range planning.
And I was just going to add, I think that the responsibility has to start with us, whether it's systems, equipment, or the talent that we've got at our sites. We've got to make sure that we understand what those CGMP practices are, make sure that we're adhering and that we're going beyond compliance. And for us at Sandoz, I mean, quality is our #1 priority.
Let me ask one follow-up. And you talked about 3,000 ANDAs. Ralph made that point yesterday. A question that we get a lot, how many of those ANDAs are high quality and how many are Me Too's? Because it's really tough to understand when that backlog comes down, how much value is going to come out of that backlog?
So it's difficult for us that sit here to say how many are value added. I think all 5 of us will say our ANDAs are definitely value added. We have questions about all the others, but clearly that's not true. So I think what we need to say is we can also ask the question, what value is in the 11th amlodipine in the market? So, but I don't know how many of the 3,000 ANDAs are the 11th and the 12th product in the market. So I think it's impossible for us to say. I think now with the GDUFA fees and the fees that you have to pay for service, in a way, I think and I hope this reduces the backlog due to no value-added ANDAs, if I can use that phrase. But it's impossible for us to say how the percentage is.
Yeah, I mean, the commissioner acknowledged this morning that they're off to a slow start, but again, we've got a responsibility in this, and that's making sure that our applications, our submissions are of a high quality.
So that topic transitions us naturally to the topic of shortages. There's been a lot of ideas around about how to reduce shortages. Now that we are kind of like sort of a year in or so, a little bit more into the process of attempting to reduce shortages. In your mind, what is the couple of most effective tools? So a lot of ideas, but the most effective tools that are being put in place right now to avoid shortages in the future?
Well, maybe I'll kick it off, and certainly, Allan, we go to you. I know from a GPhA standpoint, we started the Accelerated Recovery Initiative to work in partnership with the FDA and IMS, because sometimes we don't have the whole picture, certainly as an individual company. So I think it's vital that that relationship continues to transform itself. And additionally, as a company, when you have products that specifically have challenges, I think it's up to us to make sure we're making strategic investments, whether it's from raw materials, API, to ensure that we have ample stock for some critical products. So I think that's just a few measures in particular.
I'm going to broaden away from metrics here, because I don't know how you predict shortages. I don't know how you measure shortages. Nobody sitting on this stage is planning for shortages, but I do believe that it has improved on the basis of communication. Somebody talked about communication, and I think that the initiative that's in place is a proactive communication, which I think is very important. There's an issue, how do we deal with that issue? And then there's also reactive communication. Okay, wow, what do we do here? And by the way, I would argue in this one that the FDA has been very responsive and very communicative in helping to alleviate these shortages. So I think the initiatives that are in place are important, and we must continue with them. But I would just encourage that the open dialogue continue, because with that open dialogue, I'm confident that we can, reduce and minimize those shortages.
Yeah, I think it's vital. Really, we talk about solving the shortages, but it's really about preventing them, I believe. We have an extremely complex global supply chain in our industry. And really, not just the generic industry, across the pharmaceutical industry, it's global, it's very complex today. And some things you can predict, most things you can't. But I believe that by taking a very proactive approach and with, once again, communicating with the FDA, we talked, earlier this week we heard about the ARI initiative, which is something the GPA, some of the GPhA members came up with. That is a real very viable communication tool that we can use to understand the nature of the shortages with respect to what's going on with our competitors, frankly. And that's one of the things in terms of the industry coming together to solve shortages. It's extremely beneficial to understand what's going on across the industry, so we know where to allocate our resources to positively affect shortages or prevent shortages. And this ARI initiative is one way that accomplishes that, and we're at the pilot stage of that. And I'm very optimistic about that being a very meaningful component of this going forward.
It's probably one of the best recent examples of collaboration between industry and the FDA. I mean, FDA, from my perspective, they've done a really good job of helping to expedite reviews in several cases with us. They've done a good job of coordinating the communications on issues around a certain product across manufacturers. And the facts are, the voluntary notification to the FDA has gone up from 10 to 60 per month, and that's prevented about 90 shortages in terms of the work that we've done. So that's significant, and you know, I think we're making a difference here. There's more to do, to Tony's point. I think that ARI, we're supportive of that in the GPhA initiative.
Well, everybody on the stage here is invested, or their companies have invested heavily on quality and making sure that manufacturing facilities are state-of-the-art and compliant in every way. And we've seen that investment from our side of the world over the last couple of years. How important is that as we think about the next 3 to 5 years, and being compliant with FDA and perception? Obviously, generics are highly perceived, very highly. How important is that in addressing the shortage issue?
Well, I mean, I think that quality is absolutely the cornerstone of what this industry is about, not just in small molecules, but as we look ahead into the biologic products as well. So whether it's with drug shortages, which I think the folks on the panel have been very clear, it's pretty tough to prognosticate what's going to be short in this business, but what we can control is our quality. And I think that is just absolutely vital that we continue to stress that as the piece of this business that the generics are all about. So I think it's just that vital.
The industry has made, as we all know, significant investments, as you point out. And I believe, we all embrace the FDA's standards of quality. It's imperative for us as an industry to meet the quality standard that the agency provides for us, notwithstanding my comments earlier about a little bit more proactive communication on the compliance front. But those are table stakes, okay, in participating in this industry, competing in this industry, and we all embrace the FDA in terms of what they're doing with establishing quality standards, and our aim is to meet them.
Maybe I take it one step further. You mentioned it yourself that current good manufacturing practice, they are 30 years old. So the communication with the FDA needs to be open. What is the current thinking? It's written, what's written in the guidance, what's written in the current GMP is one thing. It's the interpretation at the end of the day. We saw in Doug's presentation yesterday the reasoning for the shortages. And those were recalls, closing of plants, and those were the top reasoning. At the same time, the shortages affected the market significantly and affected the patients at the same time. And sometimes we need to ask ourselves, with a better communication, with a better working relationship with the FDA, could we have foreseen the shortages and worked with the company instead of taking a strong action against companies, and work with the company to improve the GMP status of the plants and bypass the shortages altogether? I don't know, but I want to throw it out there.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the facts are lost, not usually on you, Ronny. But the fact is that the number of shortages has been halved since 2011. I mean, so when we were at 250. So again, I would cite it as a best practice in terms of collaboration between the industry and the FDA.
Jumping to another topic that I thought was covered well yesterday and is topical, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about this, but it's obviously the topic of settlements. The Androgel case is coming up, and maybe this is a good one for Siggi to start off with. Care to offer a view of which way that's going to go? and then the follow-up to that would be, what if it goes the FTC's way? How does that impact settlements in general and the way you view your interaction with patents as you talk to Pharma going forward?
So to begin with, I need to make clear, first of all, I'm not a lawyer. And secondly, I'm not an American citizen. So for me to criticize the Supreme Court up front is probably very inappropriate. But I do that anyway.
And we love you for it.
But the point is, obviously, the case will be heard on March 25th. It's a very important case for the whole industry. Yes, we are part of this case, but this could affect the whole industry. The only thing I want to say is it's so difficult for me to understand how a pharmaceutical IP, the intellectual property of pharmaceuticals, is treated any other way than technology IP, for example. How can an ownership of an intellectual property be treated differently because it's pharmaceuticals versus if it is Apple's IP or Samsung's IP? That's number one. Secondly, I can't see, at least I can't imagine, how we would lose the case completely so all settlements are banned. I just can't foresee that, how that would come out. Maybe the Supreme Court would restrict how the settlements are done. Maybe that's an outcome, but for the generic industry to lose overall, or for Watson and our partners to lose overall, it's so difficult to foresee that as an issue. So I think we will watch very carefully. We will see how it planned out. But it's difficult for me to understand to see the difference, why intellectual property is different in pharmaceuticals than anything else. And the last point, of course, is let's remember, if you look over the last 12 years, that the patent cases that have gone to court's decision, the decision has been 50-50 for the brand company and the generic company. That's the statistics over the last 12 years. So it's not given, and I sometimes feel that the FTC foresees that the generic industry will win every case that goes to court decision that we wouldn't settle. It's not like that. It's simple. It's intellectual property which makes sense for everybody, and we bring medicines earlier to market. For this reason, we can settle.
Yeah, you really have to distinguish between pay for delay, which, let's face it, it's sold a lot of newspapers, versus early entry legal patent settlements. And I think Siggi made the point very well, on that issue.
So just following up on that, then the Mobley's doc, I don't think even the FTC position is that you should never have a settlement between generic and branded company. But if they win what they, I guess, want, which is an a priori review of settlement before they're consumed, similar to Hart-Scott-Rodino in the case of mergers, will that actually change the way you do business?
Well, I mean, and I'll, just like Siggi, I'm not a lawyer, and I certainly am an American citizen, so I won't criticize the Supreme Court for sure. But I think when you think about these pro-consumer arrangements, patent settlements get this dirty name. And at the end of the day, I mean, the facts speak for themselves. They bring products to market before patent off. They're pro-consumer, so it benefits patients, and it benefits our customers. So what people tend to forget is the FTC does scrub all of these arrangements, and that they have a chance. And the courts have been very vocal on their support of them as well. So not just to say that they already do it, the courts already agree with it, at least to the majority. And we're the only industry, I mean, there wouldn't be another, if this would be a precedent, I can only imagine what this would do to other industries. That you'd limit the settlements.
I mean, the FTC study showed that in 2006 through 2008 that the challenges brought products to market before patent expiry by 8 years. And in 75% of the cases, that there was no payment that exchanged between the RX and GX companies. So those are the facts.
What gets lost, I think, is because we get caught up in this whole notion of being anti-competitive. But people lose lose sight of the fact that these are actually pro-competitive, particularly in the long run. If you look at the submissions, paragraph 4 submissions that would not have been filed had a settlement option not being available, that in itself is a pro-competitive pathway that the industry can provide American consumers to provide better access to medications, affordable medications. So, but we don't hear a lot about that in the media. We hear about how they're anti-competitive, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at it over a long run, they're very pro-competitive.
So the good news is we have a unified industry. The bad news is none of us are lawyers arguing.
You play one on TV.
Or play one on TV, right.
So let's reverse the question a little bit. There are areas where you actually have a good amount of commonality with the FTC. There's a room for collaboration around the issue of product hopping. I think the FTC actually sided with the industry on this particular issue. There's the issue of the use of RAMs to prevent obtaining materials for comparable materials. On the other hand, we've never seen the FTC present in this meeting We have not seen that collaboration being pursued. Is there room for closer collaboration with that regulator?
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump right in. I absolutely think the GPhA is an industry association. The FTC have to have an open dialogue, whether it was on shortages with ARI and the FDA, whether it's on REMS. Yeah, I think it's vital, and there's probably a lot more we can do to be more inclusive with them, but from an association standpoint, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I think there's no question in my mind, especially on the REMS program. We know today there's at least 10 to 15 products out there where the generic industry is unable to get a comparator drug to do a clinical trial on due to the REMS program. I think we would love to work closer with the FTC because that's really where we can add value to our patient and lower the cost of these products going forward.
This may serve as a bit of a segue, but we've seen very few settlements in the biologic area, but we've seen some unique ones. Obviously, one big one coming this year. Is that something that we should start thinking about, potential for settlements with biotech companies on biologics, or is it too early?
Well,
Okay, you get a point.
on that one.
They can't answer that. You get a point. That's
I would. Go ahead.
I'll kick it off if you.
Go ahead.
I'll kick it off. I mean, we categorize certain medicines, in different categories. But if we look to the future, and we all know that the future there's a large weighting towards biologics, and you have to ask yourself, how are they really any different than what we've been doing in the past? So I can't imagine that the trends would necessarily change. I do think, I know we're going to get to questions on approval pathways, but let's remind ourselves that there's been, as far as I know, no submissions yet for a biosimilar under the biosimilar pathway. So it is very early to ask that question. But if you go through the thought process of submission, and if there is a pathway and you ultimately get to an end stage, I can't imagine that we wouldn't also see ourselves in potential settlement discussions down the road.
This is actually a good segue to the issue of biosimilars. Tony, I wonder if you can take that, because since we're talking about the FDA, let's start with the FDA situation there. Is the FDA actually staffed appropriately to deal with the number and complexity of applications they're now getting? Mm-hmm. Or the request for meetings, request for support?
Sure. Well, what I would say is, ideally, looking at how the biologics, the biogeneric will come to market, I think just like when Hatch-Waxman was enacted, ideally I would have loved for them to have a separate office dedicated, focused on biogeneric approvals. So that's ideal. That hasn't happened. I think they have a staff of 4, if my memory serves me correct. I think it's 4. Obviously, there's not been a whole lot of submissions, but there's a lot of meetings happening. And I think that's where the key is. These meetings are happening. You've got staff, and they did commit, if memory serves me correct, about $20 million from their budget to support that personnel to ensure when these member companies have meetings that they have the proper personnel to do that. So, it's new. I think it's continuing to evolve, but certainly more investment on the people side would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think the commissioner understands the opportunity there too, and folks at the FDA, Janet. When you look at just the savings that could be afforded to the American public, 20 to 30% savings are real dollars when you start to think about the cost of these medicines, and you take a product that might be $100,000 per patient per year, and let's say they're fortunate enough to have insurance and they've got co-insurance and they've got to pay 25%. $25,000, I don't know about the other folks, but that's a sizable amount of money to be saving the American public and the payers within the system. And I think it was the one estimate was about $25 billion saved for the healthcare system over the next 10 years, which is substantial. And from our perspective, I think IMS had suggested it could be a $20 billion market by 2020. So there's a lot at stake here for patients, for the system, and I think for the industry in general.
Yeah, and I think just to add to what Don said, if you remember, if you were there for Doug Long's presentation, I think it was slide like 450 or something of Doug's presentation, that it talked about 39 approvals, but the majority of the new drug approvals at FDA were oncolytics, products of orphan status, And then we start looking at 2015 and 16, 8 of the top 10 drugs in the US will be specialty drugs, biologic medications that will require a pathway if you want to provide access and affordability. So it's that big of an issue for the healthcare system that this works for us.
One of the other things we talked about yesterday, I think Ralph did a good job of bringing it up, and he's been very vocal, but we've seen, let's call it preemptive action taken by some of the biotech companies to attempt to slow what's going to be obviously a very big opportunity for the industry, and obviously that we've seen at the state level as well. What is your response, and do you think that is a hurdle as you look to roll out biosimilars?
I mean, I think it's an issue to deal with, obviously. I mean, there is a significant market opportunity, as I just mentioned, but we've got to shape that opportunity. We've got to lead. I mean, we take that responsibility at Sandoz very seriously. And it starts with getting an established, what we call a usable pathway. And just like the EU has had one since, by the way, 2004, we've got to make sure that we've got a path that is viable. We've got to make sure that the strength of the science is what's dictating the regulatory guidelines there, and that the reliable analytics can lead to abbreviated clinical development. Because clinical development in an abbreviated way is going to be less costly for us when you're talking about going from thousands of patients in a trial to hundreds. That's going to save us money, and that's going to turn into savings for the healthcare system and the American public. And so on that front, I think the usable pathway is important, but the other dimension, to your point, is making sure that we prevent the restrictions that the originators are trying to put in place, whether it be at the state level or at the federal level. I mean, whether it's an MD having to keep records for multiple years, which they don't do today, or having a pharmacist notify physicians that a biosimilar has been prescribed, which doesn't happen today, or whether it's the patient having to sign and accept that biosimilar, which doesn't happen today. I mean, these are issues that we've got to make sure that we prevent those restrictions from going into place, and we've got to make sure that we do it with a shared voice. And I guess my call to action to everyone here today really would be that whether you're a manufacturer or you're a distributor or you're a pharmacist or a managed care organization, that we speak with one voice to whether it's the FDA, the White House, the state legislatures, and make sure that we don't allow those barriers to be put in place.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I take this next. I felt a little bit the conversation yesterday and the emphasis in Ralph's opening remarks on calling out one of the guests at the meeting was not the right time. I think it's premature to call on proactive action against this thing, because at the end of the day, the interchangeability will happen in the pharmacy probably 2016 going forward. Up until that time, the FDA is working with all of us to set down the guidance. What it will the interchangeability. I know a topic that Don is very much into is the INN naming of the biologics, which we can talk about later. The FDA needs to have the opportunity, working with us, they have the first draft, we want to work with them to lay out how the interchangeability will be. Will it be AB rated? Do we need the sales force and other things like that? But to call out one company at this point in time, I think is premature at best. That being said, I'm very clear that on small molecules, we don't want any hindering. We have 40 years of experience that the pharmacies know how to interchangeability. So we are totally against any feedback call to the doctors on that. That has been proven over and over again. But I feel this is not the right time to take that. We need to listen to the FDA. We need to get the guidance from the FDA before we spark this fight, I think, with the brand company at this point in time.
I disagree. So let's kick off a conversation, make it interesting. That's what the audience wants anyway, right?
Absolutely.
So, on one hand, I do agree with you. We have to work closely with the FDA. On the other hand, we have to stop what I call fear-mongering. And we as an industry have to stop it at its early stages. And if we don't stop it at its early stages, shame on us for letting it continue to the point of 2016, 2017, when decisions are being made. I tell the story in simple generics that to this day, I still cannot convince my father, okay, to ask for a generic when he goes to the pharmacy. He still believes the generics are bad. okay? The history of generics, we all know what they're, you would think with, you know, over 80% of the prescriptions being generic, I could convince my father that he should take one of our medicines. Not even mine, one of ours, okay? I can't convince him to do that. So, you know, when you think about where we're headed, we think of the importance relative to these medicines in the future. I think if we don't get at it soon, if we don't actively address it, then we'll pay the price in the latter half of this decade.
We're going to face all kinds of hurdles to answer your question, okay, and this is just one of them. And if you think about the European market today, where some of us are selling biosimilars there today, you know, we've faced aggressive counter-detailing measures by brand companies. So we're going to have a lot of hurdles. And back to what Don's point, we need to coalesce as an industry and recognize that these are going to come and be prepared to face them. But you know, the whole activity we see now at the state level, that's a tactic, in my opinion, that was not unexpected. Mm-hmm. And we're going to see a lot more of these things in the future, and we just need to be ready for them.
Yeah, maybe just to add to what Tom was saying, you know, there's a lot of tactics, and we've seen tactics before in small molecules that actually were very similar to this. But when I think about these barriers, whether it's state-level activity or INN naming, you know, the decisions, and obviously we want to work with the FDA because they haven't provided detailed guidance as it relates to some of the interchangeability standpoints. But, I mean, I think about common INN naming, and if we change that model, you know, and we just can't do it ourselves as a generic industry. We need the help of our payer friends, our retailers, the PBMs, the hospitals, because I can assure you, if you want unintended consequences by unique naming, you try to operate a pharmacy or substitute a product or even understand what you have if there's not any commonality. That's how important that issue will be in the coming years for us.
I mean, we're really encouraged actually by the draft guidance from one perspective, from the clinical comments that were made and the fact that the FDA had said they're going to look at the totality of the evidence. And we believe that the strength of the science should carry the day, to Siggy's point. It's just the barriers and the unnecessary restrictions being tried to be put in place at the state level is not necessary. I mean,
let me ask a question, just really quick to follow on. It's the same question I asked at the first panel, CEO panel, about 5 years ago. And I asked it in the context of oral dose, small molecule, but I want to ask it in terms of biologics. Should we expect authorized biologics, and is that a good or a bad thing?
I have no idea, since nobody else was saying, but I think there will be a number of different scenarios that play out as these products start to launch. I think all options would be open for both generic companies and innovator companies, and I would hate to say or try to estimate what that would look like. The pathway will dictate some of it. I think interchangeability will dictate some interesting other dynamics, but yeah, not sure if they'll be authorized biologics or not.
Yeah, the capabilities that are required in this marketplace should not be underestimated, from development to manufacturing to commercial. And you know, having launched one back in 2007 in the US with Omnitrope and learned a lot of hard lessons. I mean, we were languishing around a 4 market share at that point. I mean, today we're the fastest growing human growth hormone in the US at just south of 20%. But getting the sales forces right, getting the managed care and reimbursement right, getting the patient and physician services right is not easy, on top of the fact that, you know, developmentally, the analytics, the clinical development trials, the regulatory aspects, and from a manufacturing standpoint, whether it's microbial or cell culture or fill finish, I mean, this is not for the faint of heart. I mean, we've been in that business for 17 years on the development side, 30 years on the manufacturing side, and you know, it's very complicated. And not to mention the fact that the access to capital here, when you're starting to talk about clinical trials that run, you know, $200–300 million, it's substantial.
So let me actually start from exactly that point on and ask you the 10-year out question. So personal predictions for the market. If you think about the core market, anti-TNFs, oncolytics, and monoclonal antibodies, and you put yourself in post the childhood phase for biosimilars, what kind of market share will those products have versus the innovators, and at what price point versus the originator original price would they sell?
Yeah, what we've said publicly is we think that there's probably 20 to 30% savings out there in the biosimilar market. And, you know, I would just reemphasize that making sure that you've got the development, the manufacturing, the commercial capabilities is what we focus on, and we like the fact that we've got a leading position there, and that our market share is over 50% now globally, and it's a very complicated area that you're not just going to get into in a year.
I think it, the question is, what will the market share be? I think it will be significant. I think people will trust these medicines going forward like they learn to trust the generics. This will be a high-quality medicines that are brought to the market. I'm sure the FDA would not allow to the market any biologics or biosimilars that are not up to a standard. I think that's number one. Number two, I think with regards to if it is an AB rated or a branded sale, I think that will affect the saving at the end of the day. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Where will the FDA lead us down that road? And third thing, maybe on your, if there would be an authorized biosimilars, I think it comes down to the numbers. If the brand companies really see the benefit, if the prices are high enough, I'm sure they will look into that number, but I think it will be a number in an Excel sheet that will make that decision at the end of the day.
So Siggi, just to kind of force you down to an answer, if we are thinking about 10 years out, do you think, what is your personal opinion right now? Do you think it will be primarily a branded sale or primarily a generic sale 10 years out?
So how we think about it is we are ready either way. I think because companies now are taking down the BLA route, and Teva was the first one to go there. We know that we have a fixed review time of 14 months. There's exclusivity linked to that, and obviously that will be a branded sales force. I think we need to see the biosimilar route before we make a call if it is AB rated. Is it worth the hassle? Is it worth the hurdles that are put in place to go down that route versus going down the BLA route? That's number one. But I think, if I was putting a bet today, in the beginning, I guess it will be not AB rated to begin with.
So a branded sales for the first use and then it's open.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've always said that it's sort of a hybrid model, if you will. It's certainly going to take a branded component to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the product, and you're going to need some sort of branded sales force to articulate that message to the key stakeholders out there. But at the same time, as I think Tony or Don mentioned, there's lots of stakeholders involved here. There's payers, there's the group purchasing organizations potentially, there are distribution channel partners and so forth. There's lots of people that are going to have a say in terms of which products ultimately get to patients in the marketplace. And so you're going to have a strategy associated with dealing with all those stakeholders. But certainly the clinicians in the early stages are going to be important, particularly when you get to the more complex products, cancer antibodies and things like that. It's definitely going to take resources associated with articulating the safety and efficacy of your drug.
Yeah, and I think we'd mentioned this last year, but the greater the level of interchangeability we have on these products, the more affordability the market's going to have, because some of the nuances that we're talking about won't be in the same quantity. Yes, I think there'll be a very large clinical component to it. The physicians and clinicians will be critical in that stakeholder group, but at the same time, I think health plans and payers and PBM retailers, they all have the capabilities to help drive substitution and affordability. But I think, as Siggi said, it'll really depend on the level of interchangeability that we see and the evolution of how that enters the market.
Move on?
Yeah. Thinking about the U.S. market, there's been a lot of discussion about the growth outlook, and obviously there's a lot of opportunity ahead for this industry in the U.S. and elsewhere. What we've seen emerge, maybe not emerge, but more of a prevalence of, are some non-traditional paths to generic approval or a generic-like approval. And I'm thinking, the 505(b)(2) route is one example, whether it's an alternate salt formulation or whether it's over a device. What do you see in terms of some of these other growth opportunities? And I guess more importantly, is there an opportunity there, given the current environment with the focus on cost savings from the PBM side?
I think there are three things which are important to us to expand the portfolio and lower the cost to the patients. First of all, we mentioned it before, I think our access to the brand product. I think there's a significant, very expensive product where we are looking to get access to those products. I think that would open up to more products coming to the market. I think the second thing is the early decision of the FDA on citizen petition. I think that has moved the portfolio forward. I think that has helped the industry. You know, we might not agree with the decision on the CP all the time, but at the end of the day, a decision is made that allows us to bring products to market. I think the third thing is all about the communication, to get advice, because the generics today, if you look outside the solid oral dosage form, we are doing a much more complex clinical equivalent studies in the field of respiratory, semi-solid, transdermals, and other things like that, that we need better cooperation with the FDA on that. And I think without going through 505(b)(2) and other things like that, I think a good collaboration will open up opportunities to bring more products to the market.
Yeah, and I mean, complex products are where we're headed as an industry. So it's a great question. And, you know, for us, we look at that as, you know, be it, you know, first to files, injectables, complex injectables like a generic Copaxone, or biosimilars, respiratory, dermatology, ophthalmology. I mean, these are areas where, you know, back to the point on biosimilars, whether it's development, whether it's manufacturing, or whether it's the commercial capabilities, you need to have the right capabilities in each of those three areas. And you know, we like how we're positioned there in terms of a leading position across each one of those different areas. And there's an opportunity to help more patients. There's more responsibility that comes with that on our end to make sure that we're driving the access and the affordability to high quality, complex medicines.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Don makes a great point that, you know, we're all very focused on some of these complex items because there's such a huge opportunity for the patients and for our customers to save. You know, whether these products are already off patent or whether they're coming soon, there's a great opportunity for us to participate in that value chain. But at the same point, there's still a tremendous opportunity in small molecules that may be immediate release that, you know, we tend to avoid and not talk about because they may get commoditized quicker than others. But at the same time, you know, there's a need for those products from a patient population, and one that I think when you look at your portfolio development process that you have to balance out, you know, R&D costs obviously with financial outcome, but think holistically as well as how it affects the patients and our customers.
So if we kind of have to look 3 years out, let's make it 5 years out to make it easier. How this industry will be different than it is today? If you basically have to look at the skill set, the complexity, the issues that will be on the top of the table today, what will be the way those companies would look like 5 years out?
I'll take a shot at that one. Just kind of building on the conversation that's been, you know, going on. I would say the simplicity of simple molecules, of where this industry started, while there are further opportunities, as Tony has talked about, I think we would all agree with that. But I think we are becoming much more complex in the different technologies, the different delivery mechanisms, the different systems from which to bring medicines to patients. So as I look out to the future, and we think about, you know, where are we headed? On one end of the spectrum, there will always be, you know, simple molecules. On the other end of the spectrum, they'll be extremely complex, whether we want to call them biosimilars or whether we want to go to that end of the spectrum or not. And there are going to be boundaries all along, you know, that spectrum. So one of the things we're excited about as a company is the complexity that brings, the resource investment that requires, and ultimately the number of competitors that would be in the market along this spectrum. And we think that the entire industry is going to go through a game-changing experience, that we're going to see much higher barriers to entry, much more costly development cycles, much more clinical work, whether it's abbreviated clinical work or not, doesn't really matter, there's much more clinical work. So it's going to be the boundaries between what is a pure innovator, what is a pure generic, are beginning to blur. We ourselves as a company, you know, have talked about, you know, on one end of the spectrum, we're a specialty pharmaceutical company. On the other end of the spectrum, we're an INN substitution, simple molecule company. And then we've got everything in between, from branded generics to complex to NTEs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that as we look to the future, everybody on this stage and everybody in the audience that we compete with will be faced with that level of complexity and trying to determine where they can find a niche to effectively compete and win in the long term.
You know, I think what we're talking about here and what we're seeing, what we'll continue to see, to come back to your question, Ronny, is a convergence within healthcare, whether it's generic, brand, specialty, rare disease, including healthcare IT. And I think we're going to continue to see that and need the various capabilities depending upon what area you're talking about, whether it be respiratory and you talk about the drug or the device, or you talk about biosimilars where it's development, it's the manufacturing, it's the commercial aspects. It's different depending upon which area you're talking about. But developing those capabilities is going to be fundamental, and access to capital is going to be important.
I think there are two things. It's basically, as Allan and Don was saying, is there will be much more specialty companies. There will be pharmaceutical companies. There will, I'm not sure we will have very many companies that we call generic company at the time. There will be somebody, there will still be a need to supply the big volume products in the market, but there will be a lot more of the specialty companies, which Allan was mentioned, from a very complex branded product to a simpler INN interchangeable formulations. But that is where all the companies on the stage here and most of the companies in the room are doing. That's where we are moving. But also keep in mind, you were saying that 5 years ago you had this panel. Not a single person on the panel 5 years ago are here today, so we won't be here 5 years from now for sure.
Encouraging.
It's going to be taken in two different ways. It's really good or really bad. But following on this, I mean, one of the things this industry have done extremely well and does not get enough credit for is this ability to move up the complexity chain while in the same time reducing the cost. Making complex drug expensive is something that you don't need the generics for, right? Pharmaceutical does it quite well. How are you guys going to contain the cost of this? Should we expect essentially most manufacturing to move offshore? Should we expect more development in the United States? How should we think about that? How do you guys going to cost the other second half of this equation of we're going to march up the complexity stage, but at the same time maintain the cost where it needs to be?
And maybe, and I'll jump right in. I think each company probably has a different model for success on that. However, one thing that we all tend to have is scale. We have global scale manufacturing and development, and we can go across a broad range of products. And I think we can use that experience because we've had to be very lean in this generic industry to succeed, very efficient. And we can use those same processes that we've built, whether it was small molecules, to look at different complex products, whether it's in respiratory, dermatology, or others. So I do think that comes to our advantage.
Yeah, I think it's a balance, Ronny. It's a balance between the capability and where does that talent or capability reside anywhere in the world, and making sure that you're tapping into it, and on the other hand to do it productively, efficiently, and making sure that you strike that proper balance between those two things.
Maybe I come to it from a finance point of view. I think taxes have a lot to do with it, where we do our manufacturing going forward, because obviously taxes in the US are in the 30s, 36%, and many of our competitors are in a better location from tax point of view. Where you put your IP, where you put your development is very important for tax planning going forward. I think all of us hear from our tax people all the time that wherever you put your IP is very important at the end of the day. So I think it's important to keep a manufacturing in the US for sure. We will continue with controlled substances in the US. We all agree that is very important. But it might become, as long as we are comfortable that it's the same quality standards all around the world, that finance will have an impact on where we make a final decision.
I would just add that as we move along this spectrum from simple to complex, I'm not sure that any one company on this stage will have all of the abilities internally to be able to do all of those. So we're now beginning to see a paradigm where we're going to be moving to alliances and partnerships to combine capabilities in order to bring these products to market. And that clearly will have an influence of where you ultimately develop the product, where you manufacture the product. You know, the historical paradigm of taxes, and we all have lots of finance people that are advising us on where to ultimately put our IP and manufacture for tax benefits. I think will take a back seat, although I'm not 100% sure. I think it will take a back seat to where you find the capabilities and the marrying of capabilities to succeed as we move forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think alliances and partnerships are going to be important. Back to your question about how you afford this going forward and moving into more complex products. Biosimilars is a good example of that. We just saw an announcement this week with Merck forming a new alliance in the biosimilar space. So that's a good example of a mechanism I can see more and more in the future in terms of partnering in order to expand portfolios, move into different competency areas.
Yeah, as it relates to biosimilars, we have a different view. I mean, we've been at the development game for 17 years. We've been at the manufacturing game for 30 years. And in the US, commercializing biosimilar for the last 7. So, we think the access to capital and building those capabilities in-house are really important.
How important, just from a cost perspective going forward, and I know you may have some different views here, but how important is vertical integration?
Let me start because they disagree with me anyway because they have an API manufacturing. But
so yeah, I was asking the question to you anyway.
I think for some molecule it is very important. Let me get that out of the way. And it's also important to have a capability and capacity to develop your own processes in that way. Is it necessary to have 50% of your capacity own API manufactured? I don't think so. I think the competition out there, we have a very good API suppliers all around the world, but I think you need to have some capacity and capability to be able to get this competitive advantage is when you have a strategically important molecules. If you're focusing on a first to file example where API has not been developed. So I'm not advocating for a big API supply, but I think a strategic, relatively small is very important for me.
I'll play the flip side of that coin, as you would expect me to. We believe we've been in the API business a long time. Our third-party API business is, certainly in the top tier of API suppliers in the world, and we believe that there is strategic advantage to be vertically integrated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe just to add to what Allan said, we haven't had an API division for 30 years, but we've had one for about 6 or 7. And I think it's a combination. Do I think you have to have everything vertically integrated? No. But I do think it's a strategic advantage on certain products, whether, as Siggi said, kind of the first to file where you're struggling to find it or the API hasn't been developed, or when there's a large scale product that you need that total cost structure to make it most advantageous for the market.
I think it's a selective decision. You think about I talked earlier about the complexity of the global supply chain. We all source APIs from around the globe today. Sometimes it makes sense to vertically integrate, maybe a particular technology, particularly chemistry area, and return on investment in doing so. But one of the barriers out there, I think, from a generic company standpoint that's in place is that goes back to the complexity of the supply chain. If there were, 1 or 2 consolidations or acquisitions that a generic company could make to get a whole range of competencies in terms of chemistries and so forth to supply a critical mass of APIs, that kind of investment might make sense. But the problem is what we're dealing with a very fragmented supply chain today, and that's, I think, a barrier for a lot of companies to think about, doing a deal here and there and becoming more fundamental on the API side. So I believe it's a selective decision based on a particular drug or portfolio.
Just looking in, and it's actually a good segue to M&A in general, and thinking about the next several years. I think everybody on the stage, M&A has been a big part of your strategy. Certainly for Siggi, it's most recently. I remember standing up here presenting last February, telling everybody that I thought the big mergers were done, and 2 months later, was wrong. But what are the most compelling areas, either product areas, geographic areas, to focus on right now as you think about the next 12 months?
So obviously we can't speak for our companies because I think we are all listed companies, so it's impossible to go there. But I think the consolidation will continue going forward. I really feel there is a need. There's a few companies that are in a process at the moment. So I think the consolidation will continue, because remember that global generic company, real global generic companies are the 5 companies on stage here, which have operation in significant number of countries, but also in the US. So I think there is an advantage of being a global company, and then you have regional companies which are strong, maybe in Eastern Europe, maybe in Western Europe, and things like that. Those companies might continue, depend a little bit on the market. But the local players, I think they are looking for home. The local smaller players, they are looking for home. There's a lot of local players in Southern Europe, obviously in the emerging markets, that are looking for a home going forward. So I think the consolidation of the industry will continue. Maybe not at the global level, but at a smaller and local level, I'm sure that will continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to pick up on Siggy's point, it's inevitable given the structure of the market. I mean, the top 4 companies make up 50% of the sales, the next 30 make up 40%, and the last 250 or some odd companies make up 10%. So I think just by the sheer structure, it's inevitable.
Yeah, and I think from the scale of our customers, if you look at the value chain on generics and how they're dispensed, and whether they're PBMs, wholesalers, or retailers in the US, they've consolidated to a much greater degree than we have. And we require scale in volumes to secure their business. And I think to say, to kind of add to what an earlier comment was, we're seeing our customers start to reach out globally for the first time, which I think will require a whole new nuance, and I think that will help drive additional thoughts around partnerships and consolidation in our industry.
Yeah, maybe, Randall, I'll come back to your specific question. You said which areas? Well, for us, we think respiratory, ophtha, dermatology, and those were the 3 acquisitions we made, because we're not going to talk about forward-looking, but looking back in 2010 with Oriel, 2011 with Falcon, the Alcon division, and most recently with the Fujira dermatology business, an acquisition we made. We like those 3 areas as a complement to our already complex portfolio.
So using Don's example, that's exactly what I think has happened and will continue to happen. Acquisitions will be in technologies or areas of expertise that we don't have in-house that we'd want to acquire in-house along the spectrum of growth opportunity. Building on Siggy's observations, if you move into the emerging world, and here we're talking about the US, but if you move into the emerging world, the level of consolidation is rather limited. We are all global, but still in a global stage, we're relatively small and compared to regional players and local players. And as you think of where the industry's going and the types of products for the future, it's clear in my mind anyway that the local players you don't have the critical mass and don't have the access to capital to be able to compete effectively over the long term. It's actually rather consistent that the timing of that is at a timing when we're beginning to see some of the barriers to entry of local governments starting to come down, or if not coming down, at least being clearer on what an international company will need to do in order to effectively compete and win in many of these emerging markets. So I fundamentally believe you're going to see an uptick in consolidations, mergers, combinations in the emerging markets.
We got enough time for a few specific area questions. So why don't we start there? So let's start with respiratory. You're on the stage of taking different approaches to participating in the respiratory market. Some of you are looking for substitutable generics. Some of you are thinking it will be more of a hybrid approach. If you can actually just tell us a little bit about how do you would like to participate in this market, and specifically when those guidance documents come down from the FDA, what should we be looking for in terms of clarification whether a substitutable pathway is possible? Don, you doing this?
Yeah, sure. What I can say is, and we've been public about it, we do believe a fully substitutable pathway is possible in this therapeutic area, a J pathway. We haven't been public about much more in terms of our respiratory pipeline. So not wanting to have a one-way ticket to Switzerland, Ronny. I think I'll leave that to my colleagues here.
And maybe just to echo Don's commentary, that I do think there will be a J pathway for these products. I'm confident in OGD and the FDA that ensure that there's a huge opportunity for patient safety, patient savings, and I just think there's going to be ways that we can do it, and I think the science is there to ensure that we can deliver to that promise.
Yeah, I think the science is there. I agree with Tony. The FDA has been much more open in giving advice. The challenge is not only, development of respiratory is, first of all, it's the device, especially if it's the DPI. Then it's the product itself, the distribution. And then at the end of the day, it's the clinical study. And I've been asked a few times during this meeting here, what do I expect from the clinical guidance? Will there be a surrogate endpoint where it's easy to get an AB rated? I don't think so. I think the guidance will come out, but we have to prove whatever surrogate endpoint we can use in our studies going forward. But I've been very clear, the hurdle is high to get an AB rated, but I think the science have gone such a long way. We are better in developing this product today than ever before, but I still believe we have an opportunity for AB rating. At the end of the day, maybe the backup strategy, if we can't get AB rating, is a 505(b)(2) for the products. But the value, coming back to the biologics, the value of a 505(b)(2) respiratory is totally different than an AB-rated respiratory product.
Yeah, I mean, this market is really exciting. You think about, and fast forward to 2016, where the originator market could be like 50 billion, half of which comes off patent at that point. It's a sizable opportunity for us. And I think the exciting part for the generics industry is, for anyone who doesn't think innovation exists within generics, they just need to spend 5 minutes in this space and understand whether it's the product or the device. Innovation is alive and well in the generic industry to help patients and make a difference.
And if you think about the $1 trillion we've saved over the last 10 years, the billion every other day, in order for us to replicate that, we are going to have to go after these complex products, and we're going to have to find a way to get them to the markets. And I think you said earlier, Ronny, it's always amazing. People seem to be amazed at our capabilities to do just that. And I think you will see that looking at 2016 and beyond.
So on this one, I'm sorry, Tony, but since you just have signed an agreement to go after biosimilar insulin, and some of the other members of the panel have taken essentially the opposite decision, I'm going to actually ask you, obviously you're taking on a big challenge there, but in your mind, what differentiates your ability to execute against this tough but potentially sizable opportunity that will allow you to succeed?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a very recent announcement, certainly, Ronny. And, I think we wouldn't go into anything unless we thought we had the capabilities to succeed. And, I think the science and the discussions with FDA and the development will continue to evolve. And, we're very hopeful. We're very hopeful we can bring huge savings to a patient population that has enormous cost.
How should we think? There's obviously going to be some news flow around the pain market, and that opportunity from a generic perspective is a little bit unclear. How should we be thinking about ways that could play out?
Well, I think it was actually one of the things we talked about with the commissioner this morning. We've got an opportunity to play a role in terms of making sure that patient safety from a tamper-resistant abuse deterrent formulation perspective within the industry. So first and foremost, we've got a role to play there, and I think that she was open to dialogue in terms of how we figure that out together.
Anybody else willing to?
On the tamper-resistant?
A little bit more help, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think on the tamper-resistant is, clearly there's a change in formulation. I think not all tamper-resistants are created equal. I think there's a big difference between the products on the market, what kind of tamper-resistant there is. I just want to emphasize that, there has been many filing on tamper-resistant products. The guidance came out in January. I think we feel very comfortable around the guidance. I think we, as a generic industry, we can deal with a guidance like this, but the communication is coming through, and we want to work with the agency because we are all for it to bring tamper-resistant product to the market. put the hurdle as high for us as needed to get a tamper-resistant product, but you can't put a higher hurdle on the generic industry than you put for the brand industry for the same product.
We would say that definitely we need to go down the path of tamper resistance. There needs to be a similar resistance, similar protection, not necessarily exact. So as we navigate through this, we have to define what similarity means.
Yep.
But if you think of it from a patient perspective, we must go down that path together with the FDA to define what that is and protect patients.
Which kind of brings a question that for us who are looking at the industry from the outside, we always struggle with. And this is a situation where there seems to be a block at the agency in terms of approving products that should in principle create a huge amount of saving for the public. One example is the Diovan product, which has been pending at the FDA for a long time. And obviously, Don, you cannot speak to that one. But Tony, you guys have taken an active opportunity in terms of trying to force at least information out of the agency on what prevents those products from being approved. The question is, do you feel that the agency has got the right level of urgency to deal with situations where there seems to be a legalistic barrier or a structural barrier and not a scientific barrier from getting those savings to the public?
Well, I think we take an urgent position with the agency on a number of different issues, especially through the last few years. But, I think there's an opportunity that we need to continue to work with the agency as it relates to some of these legal nuances with paragraph 4s and launches, that we can continue to develop a deeper relationship. But yeah, certainly would I feel that there's an urgent enough decision on that? I would say no. That's been pretty public. But I think that's going to take just considerable conversation and development with the FDA.
So just thinking about the next 3 years, maybe everybody on the panel can comment. If we're, biologics are obviously a huge opportunity that I think you would all agree on, and all focused on participating. If we look beyond biologics, what is the biggest opportunity from your perspective for the industry and from for your company over the next 3 years?
I think for us, it's global expansion, certainly high on our list in terms of growing our business. We're a specialty player, obviously, in the sterile injectable space, U.S.-centric business, but are moving internationally, expanding our portfolios there. So that's beyond biologics, certainly a big growth driver and interest area for us.
And I think just, not just for Mylan geographic expansion or product kind of diversification, but as you look outside of the U.S., there's a huge opportunity in generic utilization. As most mature markets, no one's even close to 80%. Throughout most of Europe, it's in the teens or 20s, except Germany and the UK, Japan, just an enormous opportunity to maximize the savings potentials of generics. So I think that's a huge area of focus.
Yeah, besides the emerging growth markets, in the U.S., I would come back to respiratory again. With the $50 billion, half of which comes off patent come 2016, that's a sizable opportunity.
I'll chime in, and I would agree with everybody on the emerging markets, and I do believe that it is a tremendous opportunity for everybody. We've also said that relative to big opportunities in, let's call them, developed markets, I've already described the spectrum that we're talking about, from specialty medicines through to simple medicines, and we're actively working, as everybody on this stage is, on the complex generics, biosimilars. But you've also heard us talk about new therapeutic entities. We're very excited about having recently combined our specialty medicines development organization with our generic medicines development organization, and the real early wins that are coming out of that, of ideas of combining older generic molecules together in order to improve on convenience, safety, efficacy. The route to ultimately approval still needs to be worked out. But if you think of it from a patient standpoint, if we can add greater value, if we can make it easier for patients, that's the route for growth in many of the developed markets. There'll have to be a lot of discussion with the FDA as to what route of approvals that will take. But we believe that industrializing this segment will create a whole new opportunity for growth in the future.
Yeah, I agree with Allan. I think this is a very important point, but Also, when we look at, coming back to the emerging market, is the business model in the emerging market is very different than what we are doing here in the US. We risk expanding the usage of products. We're giving access to for sick patients. We are giving them access, for example, to oncology products, which they couldn't afford before. So usually when you come into these emerging markets, Far Eastern European market and down to Southeast Asia, you're not, the business model is not to take the market share from the branded company per se. The business model is to expand the molecule because you're giving access, you're saving lives, you're really doing, and this opportunity is so important to us going forward because US, yes, by far the biggest pharmaceutical market, but there's a lot of markets out there that are underutilized and under-medicated per se.
I just want to build on that because when you really think about patients, patient health and improved patient health outcomes, I agree with Siggi. There's a huge population, in the eastern part of the world who don't have access, to medicines. Now, governments like China, like Russia, like India, large governments will say, no, no, no. We treat our patients. They come into our hospitals, we see them, we give them medicines. If you go and you talk, to the Chinese or the Russians, the statement is actually true. The reality is it takes a full day of time to sit in a hospital, to ultimately be seen by a doctor, to get your medicine, and most of the population don't want to do that. So there's a significantly underserved population. Clearly the middle class and up are paying out of pocket. And so really it all depends on when we begin to see greater access to healthcare in these large populous markets break open. I spent a lot of time in Russia, as you know. There is a very clear strategy in place in Russia to open that up. That was put in place before the last presidential elections. It's now still in place, but I think the implementation of that will lag over time. But no doubt over time you will begin to see greater access to broad-based medicines to increase population health outcomes funded by governments, more like what we do here in the US versus what is being done there today, which is more of a branded vehicle. So there's tremendous opportunities, but it really hinges on governments and the pace of change relative to government reimbursements.
If you think about, we've come back to this whole subject of convergence between brands and generics and specialty, rare diseases. And we talk about it internally as being enterprise value. We think it matters having one standard of quality across your enterprise. We think it matters having innovation that you can leverage across your enterprise. And in terms of capabilities, one example that I'd give you is we leverage our Novartis Oncology entity for our biosimilar clinical development programs, and that's a huge advantage. So this whole matter of convergence that we keep coming back to and talking about, I think is really important for people to think through in terms of how they compete and win in the future.
So let's kind of close with another forward-looking question, which is, look, you've got a bunch of younger folks in the audience who are now getting into the industry, and you've discussed quite eloquently where the industry is going. In terms of what would you suggest that they focus on? If they have to develop some skill sets, if they have to focus on some areas that will help them in the future, can each one of you just give us the 2 or 3 sentences of what would you suggest for them? Siggi, would you like to start?
No, of course. I think for the company in the future is, and we have emphasized that all the time, is you need to emphasize on keeping the quality right. I think quality is probably the biggest important single thing for the industry going forward. We have seen that coming up over and over again. I think going forward, what's important for a company is you need to invest in your company, both obviously in operation, but also you need to invest in your pipeline. You need to do that right. I think overall, last but not least, is you need to think about your customers, the patients you're serving. What can you do to improve their lives? What can you do to bring more medicines to the market? That is the single most important thing at the end of the day.
No, I actually want to, if you can guys structure it as an advice for somebody who's starting on their career.
Yeah.
So as a career advice, it's, Generic industry is not about industry to start your career in. Think about the automobile industry. We are great compared to that for sure. But I think as a career advice, if somebody is starting in the industry,
Find another industry.
sorry.
Go to another industry.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good industry to be in. It's an opportunity. My view, and maybe quite a few of us here on the panel, is get a global perspective of things. Don't be too US focused. Try to get the opportunity of getting across the pond, get an experience from different cultures. Because yes, this is the GPhA and we are all here due to the US industry. But as a career advice, I think broaden your scope. Try to understand that there's a lot more happening on the other side of the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to add to what Siggi just said, you know, because I think you have to work for a vision, not just for a company. And it's that vision we have of this passion to bring high quality, affordable medicine to patients, whether it's in the US or around the world, is something very special. But with the generic industry, it's matched with this spirit of entrepreneurialism. It's what makes it so fun, that we're nimble, we have this great urgency. So, I mean, I think if there's an industry for a young person to get into, this is a fabulous industry.
Yeah. You know, on a larger scale, I would say that if you think about the challenges that we face, and when I say we, I don't mean just the United States, I mean most Western industrialized nations faced in health economics challenges, affording health care, population demographics. You know, the companies that are up here are all part of a bigger solution, in my opinion. And as evidenced by the amount of money that the generic drug industry has saved the American public in the last decade, over $1 trillion. And at the end of the day, companies that are going to survive are going to bring value that positively affect health economics in the United States as well as around the world. Big brand companies out there, we all know, are struggling today. They're boiling the ocean, trying to find new technologies, new chemical entities, and so forth to build their businesses on. But we, every day, part of our mission is to improve access to affordable medicines, and there's no other business that supplies the healthcare industry, whether it's hospital, ambulatory care, or whatever, that has as positive an economic effect on that customer as the generic drug industry. So that, in my opinion, adds up to survivability, and for all the young people out there, I think that's a great place to be.
Done.
Yeah, what I would say for that new person in the industry or young person in the industry would be two things. One, never underestimate the importance that we can have for patients. And the fact that we've got 80% of prescription volume in the US, what we do matters. No matter what you hear, what we do matters for patients each and every day. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I would suggest either renting or streaming, whatever the young folks do now, and a movie, Top Gun, because you need to feel the need for speed in this industry in order to survive.
Allan, you got the final word.
I guess I get to close. I'd flip the question and I'd ask, what do the young people need from the old farts on the stage in order to be successful?
Speak for yourself.
All of us who won't be here in 5 years, right? Fundamentally, number one, I think we have a lot to learn from them. And I would say, number one, don't be shy from standing up and articulating what you believe in and how we can do things differently than the way we do them today for ultimate success. Number two, I'm probably the only person on the stage who hasn't spent their entire career in this industry. At this particular point, 2/3 of my career was in fast-moving consumer goods. Number one, they weren't so fast-moving. Number two, they weren't so exciting. So if you really want to have an exciting career, this is actually a pretty interesting place. I think all of us wake up every day, go to the office, and probably leave the office having dealt with something we never thought we were going to deal with when we walked in the door. So you've got to be open to change. You've got to be interested in leading change, bringing about change. I think the final thing I would say is, I would leverage off of what Don said. What we do matters. It's important what we do here. And so if you have a passion for making a difference in an area that is important to the world, this is an area that can really make a difference. So I would combine all of those together, but I'll underscore my first statement. I'd love to hear from the younger generation what it is we could do differently to make this a better industry for them.
Maybe I can end up with the advice I got from my first boss in the industry, and I have never followed since then. He told me, honesty is good for your soul, but not so good for your career. So that's maybe the word we end on.
That's a great place to end. So I'd like to ask everybody to join me in thanking our CEOs for participating so honestly in this group.